Hello, my name is Brooks Holifield, and I taught for many years at the Candler School of Theology. My job is to moderate and to introduce, so let me introduce. Elizabeth Corrie taught at Candler, teaches at Candler. She focuses on youth education and on peace and justice topics, and she has a research interest in theories and practices of nonviolent strategies for social change. She also has serious interest in religious roots of much violence and of nonviolence. And she has been active in international peacemaking initiatives in places as wide-ranging as Israel and Northern Ireland. Ott Marshall teaches Christian ethics and conflict transformation at Candler. Her interests include violence and peacemaking and ethical questions in literature and film. She's worked with the Refugee Resettlement Program of Church World Service and the United Methodist Committee on Relief, and she's written books on the theology of hope and Christian involvement in the public square. Yehezkel Landau is Associate Professor of Interfaith Relations and holder of the Abrahamic Partnerships Chair at Hartford Seminary in Connecticut. His work has been in the fields of interfaith education and Jewish-Arab peacemaking. During the 1980s, he directed an important Israeli peace movement, and he was the co-founder and co-director of the Open House Center for Jewish-Arab coexistence in Ramallah, Israel from 1991 to 2003. He's written and lectured on Christian-Muslim-Jewish relationships, and at Hartford he directs an interfaith training program for Jews and Muslims and Christians called Building Abrahamic Partnerships. Tom Key has served since 1995 as the executive director of Theatrical Outfit in Atlanta. He's been an administrator in the theater community and an accomplished actor performing in Atlanta and in many other places. He's given off-Broadway performances in New York. He's performed with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. He's acted as the Atlanta's Alliance Theater. He conceived and co-wrote the off-Broadway musical called Cotton Patch Gospel, quite a hit, and he has a long-standing interest in theater as a way of breaking down boundaries and creating a sense of community. We are fortunate to have this informed and experienced and insightful panel, and I will take a seat, and Tom will be the first presenter. Each person will present, and then we will discuss a while among ourselves before opening the discussion to the larger group.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with Emily Dickinson. This world is not conclusion. A species stands beyond, invisible as music, but positive as sound. It beckons and it baffles. Philosophy don't know. And through a riddle at the last, sagacity must go. To guess it puzzles scholars. To gain it may have been born contempt of generations. Crucifixion. Shown, faith slips, laughs, rallies, blushes, should any see, plucks at a twig of evidence and asks, a vain the way, much gesture from the pulpit, strong hallelujahs roll, narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul. The trademark phrase of Theatrical Outfit is that we tell stories that stir the soul. The reason we do that is because of our vision that I mentioned, creating compassion one story at a time. I believe that America would not be America if it were not for the theater. It is not for nothing that the same ancient culture that gave us the idea by which we govern ourselves also gave us the theater as we know it. The reason I believe it is so powerful is because it is a language-based art form. That is, people gather in large numbers, and language is center stage without a religious, political, or special interest agenda. That is, when people come to Theatrical Outfit, we do not tell them how to vote. We do not tell them what is right or wrong, what is true or false. We begin with once upon a time and present a story of the human condition. And in comedy, in catharsis, and in wonder, we have an opportunity, at least for those couple of hours, for people from all kinds of backgrounds to understand a new model of how to be together as human beings. So, I would like to read for you how I connected this particular project of Silent Sky with our vision of creating compassion one story at a time. Jackie mentioned at the beginning of the afternoon that there's been a lot of synchronicity around this conference. And it was also mentioned in our keynote address about the contribution that Gary Gunnarsson has made. And he is the father of the playwright Lauren Gunnarsson of Silent Sky. Words don't just say things, they do things. And when they are spoken words before an audience in the theater, their effect is greatly multiplied. The words that Lauren Gunnarsson has created for Silent Sky do something rare and significant for the audience. They create wonder. Is wonder important? This is how former Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, qualified its significance. Quote, "We die on the day when our lives cease to be illuminated by the steady radiance, renewed daily, of wonder, the source of which is beyond all reason." At the beginning of the 20th century, the understanding of the size of the universe was that it was no bigger than our galaxy. But Henrietta Leavitt wondered about the size of the sky and how light travels and what music has to do with the stars and pulsating light. And as a result, our understanding of the universe in which we exist was changed forever. What Gunnarsson's play allows us to glimpse is what it took for the world to embrace the fruits of Leavitt's curiosity. She overcame the unjust wages, personal disrespect, restrictive institutional policies that she faced as a woman of her time in order to fearlessly and faithfully pursue her research. There were female allies who supported her efforts. There were male scientists who recognized that her discovery proved their collective wisdom untrue. If we are more equipped to solve the critical and systemic problems of humanity to the degree that we understand the true nature of our ultimate environment, then such luminous understanding as Henrietta Leavitt gained for herself and for us all can be seen as a compassionate achievement. The Silent Sky is vast beyond imagining. Fear might interpret this to despair that we are insignificant. Compassion can interpret this as a joy that male or female, we are all a part of an infinite whole.
In deciding, when I was talking with my colleague Ellen about what we were going to talk about today, since we're both from Candler, we're sort of representing different pieces of it. And today I'm going to represent the Youth Theological Initiative, which is the program that I direct. It's been around for 22 years, and I'm lucky to be the steward of a legacy of a program that understands that young people, if you invest in young people, you will reap many riches. The Youth Theological Initiative is a 3-week residential program. It brings young people within the broad Christian tradition from all around the world to come together to live in intentional community, which we build. It's very diverse, including across socioeconomic, theological, political, ethnic, cultural, gender, and sexual orientation perspectives. And then I hire staff and help them figure out how to cultivate a space that's safe enough and inclusive enough so that every single one of those young people can flourish and feel safe enough to explore questions. Our keynote today said that the story of the mother recognizing that she wasn't too old to learn from her children. And this is the thing I learn every summer when I'm hanging out with teenagers, that you never get too old to learn from the young people. I had wanted to show a slide, which we really couldn't do for technical reasons, but I brought the original piece of paper, which maybe I can put up if anyone wants to look at it after this panel. But over the course of our 3 weeks in our program, what we do is we engage in serious theological reflection and critical thinking about our faith. We go out into the Atlanta community and learn about critical social justice issues, poverty, homelessness, racism, immigration, refugees, sex trafficking, police brutality, all of these things. And we reflect on these critically, we reflect on them theologically, we dig deep into our own faith traditions, the Bible, and the traditions of our faith, whether it's Episcopalian, Catholic, Pentecostal, agnostic, and Methodist, and everything in between. And we work together to come up with prophetic statements. One of the things we do during our last week of the program is we write what we call kairos documents. Kairos is the Greek word for time, and it's a particular use. It's used in the New Testament when Jesus says the kairos has come. And what he means by that is that a special moment in time where something has broken in and is requiring urgent response. And kairos documents come from the tradition of writing documents in which there's naming the signs of the times, that is, naming something that's going on right now that requires urgent action, engaging deeply in your tradition to reflect on it theologically, and then issuing a call to action. So we actually have our youth, who are 17 and 18 years old, after they've learned about several different social justice issues, reach deep into their faith tradition and write these kairos documents. And they write several. We ask them to reflect on what is an issue that they're most passionate about. The document I brought was the one on interfaith dialogue, that they decided was a critical kairos issue that they wanted to reflect on. And they reflected on it, and what's interesting about that particular one is that was written by a young man from Zimbabwe who is Pentecostal, a young woman who grew up ethnically Jewish, lived in Israel and explored her Jewish roots more deeply, and then now identifies as interfaith and practices Buddhist meditation. And then a young man who identifies as an atheist, but is very articulate about his atheism, but goes to a UCC church. So those three happen to be the ones that wanted to write about interfaith dialogue, and it's brilliant because I actually came up with really solid theological and scriptural foundation for why Christians should engage in interfaith dialogue. So if you want to read that later. But I brought it because I was so proud of 17-year-olds and the mentors that work with them to be able to respond to that. The other thing I want to say is leading up to that, this doesn't come the first day when you're working with young people. This comes after 3 weeks of living together, making a safe space in which everyone can be who they really are and respect each other even in their disagreement. They go visit other religious, they go to the synagogue, they go to the mosque, they go to the Hindu temple, they learn about other religious traditions. They also learn about the vast differences within the Christian faith and the importance of ecumenical conversations. And then all the other kinds of diversity in terms of social class and race and gender. One of the theological underpinnings for us comes from the Hebrew Bible scholar and theologian Walter Brueggemann in his book, The Prophetic Imagination. In that book, he talks about the prophet's prophetic imagination consists of two things, prophetic critique and prophetic energizing. Prophetic critique, its first core moment is compassion. It's the moment when you see injustice, and feel its pain. Allow yourself to feel that pain of the injustice and grieve it. Give voice to that grief. But if you just stay in the prophetic critical moment, all you are is saying what's wrong. That does not provide prophetic imagination or a call to action. So the next move is prophetic energizing. And from the Christian tradition, and other religious traditions as well, but for us as Christians, we have a specific theological concept of hope. That is that God is calling us to something bigger, something more holistic, something around reconciliation and justice. And there's a vision there. It's called the kingdom of God. We have other words for that as well, the reign of God, the kingdom of God. But it's a vision, the peaceable kingdom, that enlivens us, that energizes us and makes us believe that change is possible, even if it can't happen in our own lifetime, but that it will happen in God's time. So that is one of the theological underpinnings, and that we try to teach our young people at the Youth Theological Initiative so that when they see the very many issues that need healing in this world, they can reach into their tradition and respond out of a faith and hope in God that change is possible and that they are called to be part of that change.
Shalom. Thank you for including me in this conversation and for getting me out of the New England icebox, which has taken a toll on my respiratory system. So I hope I can, in the Academy of Medicine and in a day devoted to public health, take care of myself as I'm sharing whatever I can bring forth. Many connections for me. In the third grade, I was a gung-ho astronomer and had my own little observatory in my house and loved the Hayden Planetarium. That was sacred space for me. And then I shifted from astronomy to biology, which was another scientific arena for exploring the mysteries of life. And then I decided, why don't you just go and study religion? With not leaving science behind or empirical, observable evidence. So I call myself a faithful realist. I'm not an optimist. I'm not a pessimist. I'm a faithful realist, and I understand the shortcomings of the human condition, having studied both psychology and theology, education, and other things. And the two laboratories, which I will share little tidbits from today, have been open house in this mixed city in Israel-Palestine called Ramle, not Ramallah, north of Jerusalem, but between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and the Hartford Seminary program that I helped to create and that I direct called Building Abrahamic Partnerships. And they're both animated, soulfully, spiritedly energized by my belief, my conviction, that we need spiritual remedies for our social and political pathologies. One of my colleagues, mentors, friends, Wesley Arya Raja, ecumenical theologian, most recently at Drew, before that at the World Council of Churches, where I met him in Geneva. He's got a book that I use in my teaching called Not Without My Neighbor, and he said, interfaith engagement should be seen as a public health campaign and not an ambulance service. I could add, or a fire brigade. So the work I do combines the prophetic praxis of critiquing abuse of power, human rights violations in Israel, Palestine, in the United States, anywhere on earth, with the priestly practice of mediating forgiveness through sacrifice. That's what I think the job description of a priest, Kohen, Corrie, however she or he is called, is. And it's, I think peace efforts fail because they focus too much on the prophetic work of critiquing wrongs done and not offering healing alternatives. So both are necessary, I believe. So at Open House in Ramle, my colleagues and I, over 25 or so years, have tried to bring the Abrahamic sibling communities together to fulfill the promise in Genesis 12, through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's as inclusive and non-discriminatory a promise, a vision that you'll find in any scripture. And so 3 families of the three of the Abrahamic faiths, a Jewish family that I married into, a Christian family, Christian Palestinian family, a Muslim Palestinian family, have worked to transform a symbolic house that was first the Palestinian Muslim family's home and then the Jewish family's home before and after 1948. They've tried to transform it into a center of healing and hope. I'll invite you to go to the website, friendsofopenhouse.org, and you'll see what's behind this laboratory. And if you know Sandy Tolan's book, The Lemon Tree, that gives the background of two families, one house standing for two peoples, one homeland. And there are 3 A's which form the pioneering peace praxis of this effort. Acknowledgement of harm done by your community toward another. Apology for the injustice, the harm inflicted, and making amends, not just lip service, but heart, soul, body service, rectification in Hebrew, tikkun, to really change the power dynamics and the possibilities for equality and reconciliation. So we have created their affirmative action programs for Arab Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, Christians and Muslims, as well as joint programs, including an annual summer camp for Jewish and Arab teens, and programs for adults and international delegations. You can see more on the website. It's an expression of a commitment to trickle up social transformation rather than waiting for the politicians to decide on some peace agreement that won't last very long, because the people haven't been prepared. So it has to be from the ground up. So both of these laboratories, Open House in Ramla, Hartford Seminary in Connecticut, are expressions of the ethos to think globally, act locally. So Open House has been open despite 2 intifadas, several wars, since 1991. And it's produced a whole generation of peace ambassadors who are working in Israel and Palestine to transform the reality. Whether this will affect the elections on March 17th remains to be seen, but it's affected the relations, including the elections in the city of Ramla. So it's a slow process, but I think more authentic, and it does involve the priestly praxis of transforming fear to trust, anger to forgiveness, and grief to the compassion for others. And everybody is bereft. Everybody has lost loved ones and dignity and land and things that make them feel violated in their basic core humanity. So compassion can come out of shared grief. But enough already. How many people do we have to bury before grief shifts to compassion? There is an amazing group called the Bereaved Families Forum, which a friend of mine, Yitzhak Frankenthal, created, which has Israeli and Palestinian families who work to transform their loss into saving grace for everybody. At Hartford Seminary, where I started teaching in 2002, the program that I direct, Building Abrahamic Partnerships, is another micro-laboratory for Jews and Christians and Muslims from all over the world, including the Middle East, many conflict zones. We have an international peacemaking program that brings Christians and Muslims from different conflict zones to get healing wisdom that they can take back home. BAP, Building Abrahamic Partnerships, is a 1-week intensive total immersion in Jewish, Christian, Muslim relationships that has an academic dimension, it's a credit-bearing course, and it has an affective, emotional, and spiritual dimension that is lubricated by various methodologies. I'll just tell you one. You can go on the website, hartsem.edu, look at the syllabus. I can send you more information. There's a praxis we call ouches and wows. Something irritates you, we have ground rules for compassionate dialogue rather than debate. Along the way, if somebody's irritated by something somebody says or does, she or he is invited to say ouch in real time, and that irritation is attended to immediately, unless it really deflects us from what we're dealing with, in which case it's parked for a short time. If somebody is delighted, amazed in a radically uplifting way, one is encouraged to say, wow. Not too much commentary required for those. There are more intra-faith than interfaith ouches. When people speak imperialistically rather than in I language, we Christians believe, we Jews do this, and other co-religionists say, don't speak for me, please, use I language. The second methodology is a fishbowl, which is described in the book Cool Tools for Hot Topics. Yes? Yes. By Evelyn Wright and Ron Craybill, one of these little good books. And we have, over 3 days, Jews in an inner circle, then Christians, and then Muslims, answering one question with the other two faith communities listening in until their turn comes. And nobody interrupts the testimonies of up to 3 minutes with a timer. And the question is, what do you need to experience from the other two faith communities in order to trust them more? Amazing things. Get a lot of catharsis comes out. And that's the key, as we know from Greek theater, for transformation. So I have brochures I can share with you if you're interested in learning more. Last thing I want to say, what I've learned over a long time is that the Middle East needs a lot of help from the further east. One of my teachers, whom I helped bring to Israel, Palestine, some years ago, was Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese Buddhist monk in Plum Village in France. Here's a piece of wisdom from Thich Nhat Hanh. To reconcile conflict, which I keep in my wallet for just such occasion. To reconcile conflict, what's in your wallet? Well, this is in mine. This is what I keep in my wallet. I don't know. It's spiritual currency. I don't know. It's not going to get me credit anyway, except maybe with you. To reconcile conflicting parties, we must have the ability to understand the suffering of both sides. If we take sides, it's impossible to do the work of reconciliation. And humans want to take sides. That's why the situation gets worse and worse. Are there people who are still available to both sides? They need not do much. They need do only one thing. Go to one side and tell all about the suffering endured by the other side, and go to the other side and tell all about the suffering endured by this side. That is our chance for peace. That can change the situation. But how many of us are able to do that? So the question is, do you have to be born with this kind of innate compassion, or can you be trained to develop greater empathy and fellow feeling? I'll leave that as an open question we can deal with later.
I have my own.
It's good.
So, wow is my first response, I thought. Oh, you gave me my opener with your wow. So my name is Ott Marshall, and I teach with Beth at Candler School of Theology. And one of the things that we've been working on there with increasing intensity is attention to justice, peace building, and conflict transformation. And a lot of the work that Yehezkel does at Hartford Seminary is familiar. We're doing some of the similar stuff in our classes at Candler. And what we're trying to do is two things. One is to equip religious leaders to engage conflict more constructively. And the second is to equip religious leaders to engage a world that's religiously diverse. And for both of those missions, compassion is essential. But it's hard to teach, right? So this question as a teacher, how do I teach compassion? I think a lot of what we do is to teach practices for fostering compassion, right? For fostering fellow feeling. And a lot of them are some of the listening exercises that Yehezkel was describing, where so much of what you're trying to do spiritually, pedagogically, intellectually, is to try to recall and perceive the connectedness between people that we know is there, but that our various forms of division obscure from sight so easily. So whatever practices we can cultivate in an ongoing way that help us to perceive those connections become essential, I think, for the work that we're trying to do in terms of fostering certain patterns of religious leadership, but also just for being fully human, to perceive these connections and try to respond to them and live them out. So that's part of the connection between what we're doing and how I understand the work of compassion being also a pedagogical practice in the classroom. But the other thing I want to say is that this has been such a delightful last hour. We had no idea how this was going to unfold, and you all are wonderful, but we've been joking about we're on a panel trying to integrate and respond to something we haven't yet seen. So this is really lovely. But one of the things that was so exciting for me is that my dad was a religion professor, my mom was a biology professor, and so I grew up in a house where religion and science were married. Literally, right? And so we had a very open spirit to the interaction between different sources of knowledge. And I've realized as I've tried to grapple with some of the questions in my teaching about working across divisions, that one of the central dispositions that is, I think, as essential and in so many ways connected with compassion is humility. And it came up in Dr. Fagie's lecture right from the start. So what I want to offer into the mix is some thoughts about what theological humility means. And I've used that in a pretty specific way, and so I'm actually going to try to, in this clumsy way, read some text here to say what I mean about theological humility. And I think theological humility is essential not only for multi-faith conversations, but for all kind of, any kind of turn when religion goes from a private faith practice into the public square. So how religion is communicating with public health, or how religion is participating in all kinds of interdisciplinary conversations. I think theological humility is essential. So what I mean is, I have three things in mind. That theological humility requires an admission of the limitations of knowledge and the partiality of perspective. That it requires explicit and deliberate hermeneutics, right? Practices of interpretation. We have to be plain about what we're doing, how we're interpreting a text or an experience. And the third is transparency about faith commitments and accountability to other sources of knowledge. So that's three features of a definition. Now, what does that actually look like? If we're thinking about practicing this, what does that look like? Well, first of all, admitting the limitations of our knowledge and the partiality of our perspective means that we no longer equate our interpretation of God's will with God's will. We make no claims to objective knowledge of God's will, but take responsibility for the subjective role in discernment. So God wants, that language, God wants, becomes, I believe that the fullest expression of God's love is. Right? It's a shift in language. God says becomes, in the case of a Christian, I think that Jesus' mandate to care for the poor means we must. This does not mean that we become thoroughly agnostic, although I always think a healthy dose of agnosticism is a good thing, or that we stop articulating and acting upon our discernment of God's will. But it does mean that we know that there is a difference between God's will and our discernment of it, and that we act and speak accordingly. The statement, this is my interpretation of God's will, is always the starting point for critical reflection and for conversation. We tend to use it as sort of the last statement, and I think it's the first statement. It opens an inquiry, it opens a conversation. So we err, we make mistakes when we use such statements to rest on our laurels, right, as though that's the end of the conversation, or to end the conversation, to foreclose the dialogue. Admitting the role of subjectivity in discernment, that is, admitting that we do not access God's will in the same way that we look up a telephone number, means that we also have a greater responsibility to interpret well. Hermeneutics, the act of interpretation, draws our attention to the lenses through which we see the world. My theology teacher in graduate school once explained the process to me this way. She said, I'm admiring a landscape when I realize that I'm looking through the window. So I begin to examine the window and the ways in which it shapes my view of the landscape. Hermeneutical practices, interpretation exercises, focus our attention on the process of our interpretation, making this process more deliberate and self-critical. This feature of theological humility, practicing hermeneutics, sounds like a series of questions. Why do you select this passage as authoritative over another? Why do you interpret that passage the way that you do? What are the commitments that you bring to the text? How does your understanding of God and your experience in this changing world inform one another? Turning these questions back on ourselves makes this a mutual inquiry rather than an inquisition. Right? Hermeneutics as a practice of theological humility sounds like an honest exchange between people who support each other's efforts to live faithfully. Thirdly, theological humility means being transparent about religious commitments and remaining accountable to other sources of knowledge as well. As a religious actor in a pluralistic space, I have to be transparent about my own convictions, and I must seek consonance between my convictions and the sources of knowledge other than my own religion. This feature of theological humility is particularly important because of the specter of religious authoritarianism. Right? Like other forms of authoritarianism, this one demands unquestioned obedience, dismisses all other sources of knowledge, and denies legitimacy to all other positions. Religious authoritarianism is antithetical to democratic discourse, for example. It enslaves individual conscience, it does violence to contrary religious and philosophical positions, and it facilitates violence against the people who hold those different views. We pave the way for religious authoritarianism whenever we insist that we alone know the will of God, that our knowledge of God's will is beyond the reach of critical inquiry, that God wills particular public policies over others, and that divine endorsement for that policy trumps any other considerations about it. Religious actors joining in collaborative public endeavors like peace building or the work of public health or multi-faith engagement and understanding for compassionate leadership have to do all of this without importing an external authority to which all other persons and views must be subject. But more than that, I think that religious actors must bring faith into these public, pluralistic, interdisciplinary spaces as one voice among many, one participant in the discussion. The other way to say this is that when entering the public square, faith needs to take a seat at the table and relinquish its claim to the podium. So I'm picking up, I want to think about something that Dr. Faggy mentioned early on about the importance of religion being a moral compass. I think that's true, but I also think that how religion is a moral compass and what the content, right, what the direction is, have to be interrogated really carefully. So I think it's possible for a religious actor to enter into these conversations in ways that are honest and caring and compassionate and humble, as opposed to dogmatic and authoritarian. So I think when religious actors participate with that spirit of mutuality and humility in their work, then the seeds for compassionate engagement and the kinds of practices of compassionate dialogue that Yehezkel is mentioning become more possible.
Thank you. Thank each of you. It also occurs to me that science perhaps has its own moral compass insofar as the search for truth is a moral value deeply held in the scientific community. But I really wanted to turn our attention just, and this can be free-flowing after I impose a few questions. I want to come back to the image of silence in the play. And we saw silence in the play, silence as being imposed on, silence as imposed on Henrietta by a male culture in which she was not expected to have full voice. But also silence required for, the silence that was required for her to hear what the stars were saying was a difficult kind of silence. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to ask Tom if he would talk for just a few moments about silence in the play, and then I'd like to ask a specific question of the rest of you to give me some concrete examples, and of course you have already done this, but to highlight specific examples of the way in which you have taught people to be sufficiently silent to hear, to listen to another, and the way in which that kind of silence has enhanced or nourished the kind of work you've tried to do. But Tom, would you talk about, if it's not a contradiction in terms, talk about silence for a moment?
Sure. I think about a quote from an Ursula Le Guin novel, "Only in silence comes the word," with a capital W. It's important to realize that Henrietta Leavitt was hard of hearing. And when she didn't want to listen, she could just take her hearing aid out. And I want to say something about the theater as a tool for silence and therefore participating in compassion as well as in the specific story. One of the great benefits of the theater is it is an occasion where we can agree to be silent. We're not always successful with people turning off their cell phones. There was a wonderful story of one of our subscribers who took their children to the home of St. Francis Assisi, and they were doing a play about his life, and they let their 9-year-old son introduce the play. And because he had been used to attending Theatrical Outfit, he said to all the monks and sisters present, "Please turn off your cell phones before we begin." But as you were mentioning, how can we be compassionate for the suffering of others unless we understand their suffering? How can we understand the suffering of others if we don't listen to their stories? How can we listen to stories unless we are silent and attend to the other? I can think of one play that we did called Brownie Points by local playwright Janice Schaefer, about 5 women who take 14 of their first grade girls on an overnight campout. 2 of the women are black, 1 is Jewish, and they go to a famously racist portion of Georgia for this overnight camp out. And the 2 black women are assigned all the cooking and cleaning. It's a very, very, very funny play, and it's a very, very, very provocative play. And we had a discussion after every single production, and I thought, where is there a better discussion going on about race right now than in this theater? Because we can't hide behind that part of our story that we think the other doesn't know, because we've all agreed with our attention and our laughter that this story is true, and this is where we are. And if we're going to solve the problems of where we are, we have to agree on it's not where we would like it to be, but it exists. So there's a beautiful parallel too. I think that part of Henrietta's patience, and she had to ask for her father's dowry in order to fund her going to Harvard and working on these wages. I think that part of her capacity to have the patience that after years and years and years resulted in her discovery that her lack of hearing created the inner space in which the word with a capital W could become present, of the other in the universe and how connected we are to a vast reality.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you work with teenagers, you don't have a lot of silence. But I do think that it was very helpful, Brooks, the way you talked about silence in 2 different ways. The silencing, the detriment of silencing, and then the benefit of silence. And one of the things I did resonate for me with what we saw in the scenes of the play was, of course, the way in which the patriarchal context silenced the women so that you couldn't, and then that blinded them from more knowledge and truth, right? And I'm of the opinion that we as a society silence young people, and in many ways, and depending on where they are socioeconomically and racially and culturally, sometimes we shoot them dead in the street. And we silence them in all kinds of ways. We silence them by making them feel that their entire self-worth is based on their test scores. We make them feel that their entire self-worth is based on how thin they are and how much they can produce for us. And we silence them by putting them in jails. And so what we do at YTI is we really try to engage in some conflict transformation in the midst of a larger culture that's engaged in a war on kids. And so what I do is I try to teach my staff to create the healthy kind of silence. That is, as an adult, choosing not to be the expert in the room, choosing not to answer every question. So the typical youth minister or pastor is often expected to answer all the questions that a young person has about faith, right? And one of the reasons why a lot of adults don't want to be involved in youth ministry is because they're afraid they don't have the right answers, and they don't want to work with kids because they actually have really tough answers, or tough questions, right? I mean, much like Dr. Fagie's discussion with his mother, I mean, asking the logical questions that come from different theological doctrines, and then we realize that we don't have it all sewn up and we can't give the right answer, right? And our pedagogy at YTI is, don't worry about it. You don't need to have the right answer. What you want is to make space for questions. And if a young person asks you a question, say, that's really interesting. What do you think about that? And then when they have a chance to actually try to answer it for themselves, then perhaps pose 5 more productive and evocative questions that get them thinking deeper about where those questions lead. So we don't have a lot of active silence at YTI or working with youth, but we try to pay attention to the fact that young people are normally silenced, and to create a space for their voice by silencing ourselves for the greater good as adults. We do a few other practical techniques, which is, as an intentional community, we agree to not have too many electronics around. So we do silence our cell phones, and don't have television and don't have video games, and we play card games and do puzzles and play ultimate frisbee, and that allows for actual conversation that's not mediated by digital forms, and that creates a new way of thinking about how to silence some of the distractions that keep us from building community. So that's kind of how silence works with us.
A lot of thoughts swimming inside me, so I'll try to maybe focus on 2. One is the political question of parity, equality, liberating inclusiveness across gender, race, religious lines, age, whatever, class. I think that proactive intentionality is very important in our Building Abrahamic Partnerships context. We try to have parity across the 3 traditions. We try to have gender balance. We do have gender balance across the teaching staff in the 3 traditions, and try to the extent that we can recruit people rather than first come, first serve. You pay your tuition, you're in, to have different, a wide representation of voices and perspectives present. In terms of how words get interpreted, for good and for ill, I will tell you one short story, very dramatic incident for me. I'm just going to encapsulate it. A rabbi friend of mine in the room, male rabbi friend, got upset, really a super ouch for him, when an African-American woman minister from Bridgeport, Connecticut, used the word Zion. She was affiliated with AME Zion Church, and he said, you can't rip that word off from our experience. And she said, who are you to tell me what my experience is and how I name it? Well, and we had a critical mass of African Americans in that particular BAP cohort. This is Black History Month, so I want to lift that up. It's also beginning of Lent, so we need to also repent of our blind spots, especially. So this was a blind spot for this rabbi friend, and it was an African-American man named Marcus Blackwell who said, listen, Rabbi David, you have to understand, you should understand, I want you to understand that when I look at you, I don't see you, first of all, as a Jew. I see you as a white man. And that's going to begin from there to define how we relate to each other. So we have to understand that there are explicit, ostensible vectors, factors in the room, like religion. In a seminary, religion is privileged, preferenced, but there are other social dynamics going on which leaders have to attend to. And so they're not blindsided, like when the race dimension trumps the religious one for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a whole day. Okay. I mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh. So I try to incorporate in my spiritual practice also contemplative methods that are more associated with the Far East and the Middle East, but of course we all have mystical praxis in our tradition, including Jews. Now, Jews are not, I don't know about innately, we are not conditioned to value silence. Very verbal people. We love texts, we love words, words upon words upon words. We schlep libraries all over the place. Mine's gone back and forth to Israel. It's really, I know, I should invest in a Kindle and it would save me a lot. But I'm so 20th century, I'm just a bibliophile. I love books. Anyway, so the closest, the book of books, the Hebrew scriptures for me, comes to the wisdom of Zen Buddhism is in 1 Kings 19, when the prophet Elijah, is running away from the death sentence of Jezebel, the Phoenician queen. He's just slaughtered hundreds of her prophets there up in Haifa. So he's running for his life, and he goes back to the same holy mountain where the 10 utterances, the 10 statements, all in words, the so-called 10 commandments, were revealed. The moral code and theological code for humanity. And that's very important. So he gets the counter revelation. First he has the sound and light show, the fire and the thunder and the earthquake, and God's presence isn't in all of these noisy phenomena. And then the revelation comes in something that is usually mistranslated in English Bibles as the still small voice. That's not what the Hebrew says. Kol demad daka is better rendered in English as the subtle voice of muteness. So, what is the sound of one hand clapping? What is the sound of muteness speaking, subtly or otherwise? It's a humbling realization, right? Yes, it should shut us up.
All right, well, let me pick up with, do I have time to, am I okay? Sure. Okay. Can I pick up with Thich Nhat Hanh? I'm so glad you brought him and carry him in your wallet. So one of the ways that we practice silence in classes and just generally is through forms of compassion meditation. And Thich Nhat Hanh is such a wonderful exemplar of that. Different forms of imagining, well, let me start in a different place, which is that I think it's easier to practice compassion for people who are suffering or poor or struggling. And it's harder, I think, to practice compassion for people who make us so angry or our opponents. That's why some of the intra-faith conversations are so much more difficult. I think the people in our own traditions who just offend us or infuriate us. So, but Thich Nhat Hanh leads in lots of compassion meditation practices of imagining this person with whom you're in disagreement or the person who has offended you to the core, and imagining that person flooded with light, or as a child, a 5-year-old child, but it's a whole long and ongoing work of imagination in silence to extend this kind of fellow feeling or compassion toward this other person. So forms of meditation would be central, I think. The other thing, just a simple form of silence that's so crucial for cultivating compassion and also dealing with conflict constructively is breathing. Because one of the first things that happens to us when we're feeling somehow under threat is that we start shutting down in all kinds of ways. We can't remain open to a new idea. We're just feel vulnerable, and so we shut down. So just the experience of opening your chest and breathing deeply in silence is, I think, a central aspect. Although if you're breathing properly, it's not silent. So you make noise when you're breathing well. But the other thing is, in a different vein, is to think about forms of listening as silencing the voices in your head that are going to judgment, or the sort of a pattern of listening where what you're listening for is the weakness in the other person's argument, right? Waiting to jump in. And so a practice of a silencing practice is silencing that, the voice of judgment. And instead, what you're listening for is the other person's strongest argument, right? The place that you hadn't considered before. So I think that's an important aspect of silencing voices of judgment. And that leads to my next thing, which is that the other part of my life is teaching Christian ethics, which always gives people willies because they think I'm talking about Christian morals, which I'm not. So when we teach Christian ethics, it's investigating the why of things, right? Why do people who share this tradition come to such different decisions about things, right? It's the investigating the morality that seems to be operating. But one of the most important things that I think we do in those classes is to really encourage students and all of us to practice a kind of moral pause. So instead of moving so quickly to judgment of a person or a situation, we exercise a moral pause to reflect, to gather some more information, to listen to a different point of view. So that'd be another practice of silence, I think, that I'd underscore, the moral pause.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes, so we have time for 1 or 2 questions if they're... Larry?
Yeah, I would like to ask Professor Landau to talk a little bit more about the details behind the open house situation. I found it absolutely fascinating on your website, and it seems to me it raises almost all the major issues that we face in this type of situation. It's very different. How did you pull it together? What was your wife's? She didn't know how the house having been confiscated, I gather, first and so on. All that.
Well, I invite people to go to the website or to read Sandy Toland's book, because I can't do justice to it in just a short time. But my former wife, Dalia, who grew up in that house, was told that the Arabs had run away and that the Israeli government had just taken over these empty refugee homes, and she discovered later that they'd been expelled from Ramla and Lida and other places. And about half the 750,000 Palestinian refugees had been forcibly evacuated in a war of survival. So I don't use terms like ethnic cleansing. A survival ethic took over, which doesn't justify anything. It just tries to, for me, to have compassion for people who did wrong, to create my country, my adopted country. And so we have to do, it's never too late to make amends and do tikkun. And in Jewish mysticism, you can rectify things even retroactively. So it's a Jubilee ethic. This is also part of the economic requirement. Every 50 years, you know, the imbalances get rectified in the economy, so we don't have haves and have-nots. We don't have poverty at such an everlasting generation to generation a curse, a blight on humanity. So it's time for the Palestinians to come home to Palestine, but not at the expense of the Jews who have been empowered to come home. So that's the essential moral imperative behind this project, is to tell the stories honestly, self-critically, and not to let the two propaganda machines and the blame game destroy any chance for our children and grandchildren to enjoy justice and peace. So that's all I'm going to say right now.
Thank you. Is there another question? Oh, in the back? Okay.
Given the crisis in the Middle East and jihadists, how do you see compassion integrating itself into that conflict in the midst of everybody really wanting violence and war?
Short answer is empower the compassionate teachers and role models to teach true Islam or Judaism or Christianity. So you don't have Jewish settlers with a manifest destiny, pseudo-messianic vision. I call it territorialatry. It's idolatry of land. That has to be countered. There are subtle and not too subtle Christian crusaders, sometimes allied with Jewish apocalypticists. That has to be countered. And Islamic apocalypticists also who think the cosmic ends justify murderous means. This is all vile perversion of everything our sacred texts call us to be and do. And so one of the things is redeeming, healing stories into the media. The media is a serious part of our problem because the ISIS people know this. Gosh, they are really experts at terrorizing people through these videos. That's their aim. So how do we use the media more effectively and compassionately? I'll just put that out there because this is really important, and it challenges a certain commercial ethos in terms of what sells. So I would like whoever was head of Merck, okay, is this person still alive? The one who gave out the 1 billion vaccines? That person still around? Yes. Still working at Merck or retired from Merck? Retired. That person should be the media czar for the United States. Okay, Obama and companies should empower him or her to oversee all the media so that the media don't have a bottom line mentality in terms of what sells and ratings and all that. What heals should dictate what, because our imaginations and our spirits are corrupted. They are polluted on an hourly basis, if not on a minute-by-minute basis, and our hope goes away, and we're just paralyzed. And this is, it's a key leverage point for the transformation of our consciousness and our society. And how we do that, let's bring hearts and minds, heartstorm, brainstorm, and find out how to do that, because I think the media is a key factor in this whole challenge.
That's a wonderful way to end an invigorating discussion. I have to thank the panelists and thank particularly the actors and directors who brought us this wonderful excerpt. Thank you.